The cozy cafe buzzed with quiet chatter and the comforting clatter of cups against saucers. In a corner by the window, Barron Trump sat alone, his tall frame relaxed as he flipped through the pages of a book, a steaming cup of coffee beside him. The bold red MAGA hat on his head stood out against the soft, neutral tones of the cafe, catching the occasional glance from passers-by. The calm was interrupted as the door swung open, and a man in his mid-40s strode in, his eyes immediately locking onto Barron. His face darkened, his irritation evident as he took in the hat. Without hesitation, he approached Barron's table, his voice cutting through the gentle hum of the room. "Why are you wearing that?" he demanded, his tone sharp and laced with disbelief. The cafe fell silent. Conversations ceased, cups were set down mid-sip, and every eye turned to the unfolding confrontation. Barron looked up, his expression calm, unshaken by the man's pointed question. The tension in the room thickened as everyone waited, breath held, for what would happen next. The man's voice broke through the cafe's comfortable hum like a crack of thunder. "That hat," he said, jabbing a finger toward Barron, "is everything wrong with this country." His tone was sharp, laced with frustration that felt too heavy for the space. Heads turned, conversations halted, and the once warm atmosphere turned icy with tension. Barron looked up, his face calm, his fingers still tracing the edge of his coffee cup. He didn't flinch or react, his silence standing in stark contrast to the man's escalating anger. The bold red MAGA hat on his head seemed to burn brighter under the cafe's soft lights, a beacon drawing all attention. "You think you understand what people are going through?" the man continued, his voice rising as he stepped closer to Barron's table. "You, with your privilege, your family name, and that hat, you have no idea what real struggles are. Do you know what it feels like to lose everything? To work your whole life and still feel left behind?" The cafe seemed to collectively hold its breath. A barista stood frozen mid-pour, her hand trembling slightly as she stared at the unfolding scene. A mother near the window pulled her child closer, whispering something to him as her eyes darted between the man and Barron. The quiet clink of a spoon being set down on a saucer echoed louder than it should have, as though the room itself was straining to listen. Barron remained silent, his expression unreadable. His hands rested lightly on the table, one brushing the rim of his coffee cup, while the other lay still beside the open book. There was no sign of defensiveness, no hint of retaliation. His stillness, calm yet intentional, seemed to unnerve the man more than any words could have. The man's frustration boiled over. "You walk in here with that hat, acting like it doesn't mean anything, but do you know what it feels like for people like me? People who've been ignored, dismissed, and left to fend for themselves while slogans like that make promises that never come true?" A murmur rippled through the cafe, an uneasy shuffle of feet, and the faint sound of whispers exchanged between tables. The tension was unbearable, thick and oppressive, like the air before a storm. Yet Barron stayed composed, his gaze steady, his fingers now still on the cup's smooth surface. Someone near the counter coughed nervously, breaking the silence just enough to remind everyone they were still there, still part of this moment. The man's face was red now, his breathing heavy from the emotion pouring out of him. He stepped back slightly as though realizing the force of his own words, but the anger in his eyes remained, and still, Barron said nothing. His silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate, a quiet strength that seemed to absorb the man's frustration without breaking. The cafe waited, every person caught in the tension, wondering what Barron would say, if he would say anything at all. The seconds stretched endlessly, the weight of the moment growing heavier with each passing beat. The cafe remained thick with tension, the stranger's words still echoing in the air. All eyes were on Barron, who had yet to say anything. His quiet composure seemed almost unnatural in the face of the storm that had just erupted. He gently set his coffee cup down and straightened in his chair. The pause stretched long enough to make the man shift uncomfortably, his earlier aggression now flickering with uncertainty. When Barron finally spoke, his voice was calm, low, and steady, but it carried a weight that surprised everyone in the room. "I hear you," he said simply, his tone lacking any trace of defensiveness. The stranger froze, his brows furrowing as if he hadn't expected such a measured response. "I can't pretend to understand everything you've been through," Barron continued, "but I know what it feels like to be judged without being given a chance." The man blinked, his anger momentarily tempered by Barron's unexpected words. The room, still silent, seemed to lean closer. Barron glanced down at his hands, gathering his thoughts. His calm demeanor wasn't rehearsed. It was intentional, as if he wanted to ensure his words didn't add fuel to the fire. "When I started at a new school a few years ago, Barron began, his voice quieter now. "I met a boy named Aaron. He came from a rough neighborhood, and everyone treated him like trouble before he even said a word. I remember watching him sit alone at lunch every day, not because he wanted to, but because people assumed he didn't belong." The man's expression softened slightly, the sharp edge of his anger dulling as Barron's story unfolded. The cafe, captivated by the unexpected turn, remained hushed. "One day," Barron continued, his eyes lifting to meet the man's, "I sat with him. I didn't know what to say, but it didn't matter. Aaron told me about his life, about the things he'd been through, the way people looked at him like he was less than them just because of where he came from. And you know what he said to me?" Barron paused, his gaze unwavering. "They only see what's on the outside. They don't care who I really am." A faint murmur rippled through the room. Barron leaned forward slightly, his voice gaining a gentle firmness. "That stayed with me. It reminded me that symbols, clothes, and appearances don't define us. People do." He gestured to the MAGA hat on his head. "For me, this hat isn't about division. It's about believing that people can come together even when we disagree. It's about trying to see beyond what's easy to judge." The man's shoulders slumped slightly, his anger giving way to something closer to introspection. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Around them, the cafe seemed to exhale collectively. Barron leaned back, his hands resting on the table. "I don't expect everyone to agree with me," he said softly, "but I hope we can at least try to understand each other." The stranger's face softened further, his earlier fire dimming into quiet reflection. The room, once tense with division, now carried a sense of possibility, an unspoken agreement that something had shifted. Barron's calm rebuttal hadn't just diffused the confrontation, it had opened a door. The room felt alive with a tension that had begun to shift, almost imperceptibly, from confrontation to reflection. The stranger, his earlier anger now simmering into unease, glanced around the cafe as if searching for validation. He was met not with judgment but with curious, questioning gazes. Then, from a table near the counter, a woman broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "I know what it's like to be judged by something as simple as what you wear," she said, her words trembling slightly. The woman, in her mid-40s, clutched her coffee cup tightly, her knuckles white against the ceramic. "When my family moved here, we didn't look like everyone else. My kids wore hand-me-downs, and I always felt the stares, the whispers. People didn't bother to know us. They decided who we were before we even said a word." The stranger's eyes darted to her, his expression flickering between discomfort and something closer to understanding. Her vulnerability seemed to reach him in a way that words hadn't before. She took a shaky breath, her voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't the words that hurt the most," she continued. "It was the assumptions, the way people treated us, like we didn't belong, like we weren't worth their time." A heavy silence settled over the room as her story hung in the air. Barron, seated quietly at his table, gave her a small nod, an acknowledgement of the courage it took to speak. Her words had shifted the energy in the room further, opening a crack in the wall that had divided the stranger from the rest of the cafe. Then, from a table near the back, another voice rose. A man in his late 30s, dressed casually in a flannel shirt and jeans, leaned forward, his hands resting on the edge of his table. "You know," he began, his tone thoughtful, "it's not really about hats or symbols, is it? It's about how quick we are to shut each other down, to assume the worst." He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the stranger before moving to Barron. "We've all been guilty of it. I know I have." The stranger shifted on his feet, his posture losing its earlier rigidity. His gaze dropped to the floor for a moment before he looked back up, his eyes scanning the faces around him. He seemed smaller now, less certain, as though the collective voices in the room had peeled back layers of his anger to reveal something more fragile beneath. The man in the flannel continued, his voice gaining strength. "The problem isn't disagreement. It's the way we treat each other when we disagree. Respect shouldn't depend on what side you're on. It should just be the baseline." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The stranger's shoulders slumped slightly, his fiery stance now tempered by an unmistakable weight of introspection. For the first time, he looked directly at Barron, not with anger, but with a question in his eyes, one that seemed to ask, "Did I get this wrong?" The tension in the room softened further, replaced by something gentler, almost hopeful. The people in the cafe weren't just spectators anymore. They were part of a shared moment, one that was slowly transforming from conflict into connection. Barron sat quietly, his presence steady and calm, as if waiting for the man to take the next step. The room was no longer a battleground but a space for healing, where voices of reason and empathy had begun to take root. The man stood still for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor as if the weight of his own thoughts had become too heavy to bear. The cafe was utterly silent, the kind of quiet that made every breath, every creak of a chair, feel amplified. He inhaled deeply, his shoulders rising and falling in a slow, deliberate rhythm, before finally lifting his eyes to meet Barron's calm, steady gaze. "You know," the man began, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier edge, "I wasn't always like this." His tone carried a vulnerability that caught the room off guard, the anger from moments before replaced by something raw, something real. "There was a time when I had a job I loved, a home I was proud of, and a family I could provide for without thinking twice." He paused, swallowing hard, his eyes glistening as he forced himself to continue. "But then things started changing, little by little at first. The company I worked for downsized, and I was one of the ones let go. Nothing personal," they said, "just business." But it felt personal. It was personal. Everything I'd worked for, gone, just like that. The man's voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, visibly struggling to keep his emotions in check. "I tried to find something else, but it felt like the world had moved on without me. I was too old, too slow, too stuck in my ways, and everywhere I looked, all I saw were people pointing fingers, at politics, at leaders, at symbols. So I started pointing too. It felt easier than admitting I didn't know how to fix my own life." The room seemed to lean into his words, the collective empathy of the cafe patrons palpable. Even the barista, who had been quietly rearranging mugs behind the counter, had stopped, her hands resting on the edge of the sink as she listened intently. The man's gaze returned to Barron, and for the first time, there was no hostility in his eyes, just a kind of weary confusion. "When I saw that hat," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it felt like it represented everything I've been angry about, everything I've lost. But maybe," he hesitated, his words faltering, "maybe I was just looking for someone to blame." Barron nodded, his expression calm but tinged with something deeper, understanding. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting lightly on the table. "Thank you for sharing that," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "I know that wasn't easy." The man blinked, clearly taken aback by Barron's gratitude. "Why would you thank me?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Because it takes courage to admit what you just did," Barron replied. "It's not easy to open up, especially in a room full of strangers. But you did, and that means something." The man exhaled slowly, as if the simple act of being heard had lifted a weight he didn't realize he'd been carrying. Around them, the cafe began to stir, the tension of earlier melting into a quieter, more introspective energy. People exchanged glances, some nodding, others offering faint, supportive smiles. In that moment, the man wasn't just a figure of anger and frustration. He was human, vulnerable, and trying to make sense of his pain. And in the warmth of Barron's quiet acknowledgement, he found the space to begin healing. Barron leaned back slightly in his chair, his calm gaze never leaving the man. The tension in the room had shifted into something softer, something fragile, as if the collective breath of the cafe was held in unison. Slowly, Barron reached up and removed the bold red MAGA hat from his head. The gesture, simple yet deliberate, sent a ripple of surprise through the room. He placed the hat on the table in front of him, his fingers brushing the brim lightly, as if to remind everyone that it wasn't the object that mattered. "It's not this hat that defines me," Barron said, his voice steady but filled with quiet conviction. "It's what I do, how I treat people, and the values I try to live by that truly matter." His words hung in the air, soft yet powerful, and the man stared at the hat on the table, his earlier anger now replaced by something closer to reflection. Barron gestured toward the chair across from him. "Why don't you sit?" he offered, his tone warm but earnest. "Let me buy you a coffee. We can talk." The man hesitated, his eyes darting from the hat to Barron's face and then to the curious gazes of the cafe's patrons. The room seemed to shrink in that moment, the weight of dozens of watching eyes pressing down on him. He looked like he might refuse, his pride struggling to assert itself. But then something in Barron's expression, a sincerity that couldn't be faked, softened him. After a long pause, the man nodded, almost imperceptibly at first, then with a firmer movement. He pulled out the chair and sat down, his posture still tense but his face showing the beginnings of vulnerability. Barron waved to the barista, who had been frozen behind the counter, and called out gently, "2 coffees, please. On me." The barista nodded quickly, as if relieved to have something to do. The clatter of mugs and the hiss of the espresso machine filled the silence as the cafe resumed its quiet hum. Though the energy in the room remained electric, all eyes stayed on the pair. Curiosity mingled with admiration at what was unfolding before them. Barron leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table. "I know it's been a hard road for you," he said softly, "and I can't pretend to understand everything you've been through, but I think we all carry struggles, even if they look different." The man, still wary, met Barron's gaze for the first time since sitting down. "You don't seem like someone who's had to struggle," he said, his tone more contemplative than accusatory. Barron smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both understanding and a hint of sadness. "Everyone struggles," he replied. "Sometimes it's just harder to see." The man exhaled, his shoulders loosening ever so slightly. The two began to talk, their conversation quieter now, more personal. Around them, the café seemed to exhale too, the earlier tension replaced by a sense of peace. It was a moment of humility and grace, one that lingered long after the coffees were placed gently on the table. As the café gradually settled back into its rhythm, the charged energy that had gripped the room gave way to a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. Conversations resumed, but they were softer now, infused with a sense of shared humanity that hadn't been there before. Strangers who had sat in silence minutes earlier now leaned toward each other, exchanging quiet words about their own experiences with judgment, misunderstanding, and moments of unexpected grace. Near the counter, the barista, who had been an anxious observer of the confrontation, took a deep breath and approached Barron's table. Her hands were steady now as she carried a fresh cup of coffee, its steam curling into the air. She placed it gently in front of him, her voice warm but trembling slightly as she said, "This one's on the house. I've been working here for years, and I've never seen anyone handle something like that with so much patience and kindness." "Thank you." Barron looked up at her, his calm demeanor brightened by a soft smile. "Thank you," he said, his sincerity evident. "But I think we all had a part in this today." His words hung in the air for a moment, a quiet acknowledgement of the room's collective transformation. At the same time, the man who had sparked the earlier confrontation stood near the door, his posture no longer rigid with tension. His shoulders, which had carried the weight of his anger and frustration, now seemed lighter. His expression had softened, the lines of his face less harsh, as if a small piece of the burden he carried had been lifted. He looked back at Barron, hesitated for a moment, and then gave a small, almost shy nod of acknowledgement. Barron returned the nod, his calm gaze steady and unwavering. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it didn't need to be. Sometimes a simple look was enough to convey understanding, forgiveness, and the beginning of something better. As the man stepped outside, a few customers exchanged glances, their expressions marked by a subtle mix of awe and admiration. One of them, a middle-aged woman with silver hair, whispered to her companion, "I didn't expect to see something like this today. That boy, he's wiser than most adults I know." Barron finished his coffee and stood, placing the now empty cup back on the counter with a quiet thank you to the barista. He reached for the MAGA hat that had been sitting on the table, brushing his fingers along its brim as if considering the weight it carried, not just as a symbol, but as a conversation starter, a catalyst for understanding. With a quiet resolve, he placed it back on his head. As he walked toward the door, he paused for a moment, looking back at the café. He gave the barista a grateful smile and nodded once more to the room, a gesture that seemed to say, "This isn't about me, it's about us." Then, with the same quiet grace that had defined him throughout, he stepped out into the world, leaving behind an indelible impression. For those who witnessed it, the moment wasn't just about a hat or a conversation. It was a reminder of the transformative power of empathy, patience, and understanding. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the power of kindness and understanding in bridging divides. Let us know in the comments. How would you handle a moment like this? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that spark reflection and hope. Let's keep spreading positivity, one story at a time.